Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Welcome to today's episode of the HERHealth Podcast. My name is Dr. Sarah Yursich. I'm an early career researcher with the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity. Today, we're honored to welcome two leading experts in intimate partner violence-caused brain injury, Karen and Paul. Karen Mason is the co-founder and executive director of SOAR, which stands for Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research, Canada's only organization solely focused on IPV-caused brain injury. While her career spans more than 35 years across the public and private sectors, and she has spent over a decade in nonprofit leadership, Karen is a passionate advocate for survivors and a champion of evidence-based change. The co-presenter is Dr. Paul van Donkelaar, professor at the University of British Columbia and co-founder and scientific advisor for SOAR. He's a researcher whose work examines the biological and neurological impacts of brain injury, particularly as it relates to women who've experienced violence. Together, Karen and Paul are advancing research, awareness, and care that integrates trauma and brain injury-informed lenses. Welcome, Karen, Paul. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
To start, could you walk us through how brain injury happens in the context of intimate partner violence and why concussions and strangulations are especially common mechanisms?
Sure. So intimate partner violence can have many forms. So it can be psychological, emotional, sexual, financial, religious, etc. But a big component is physical. So physical assault in some form of the partner to the person experiencing it. And so quite often in the context of physical intimate partner violence, there can be blows to the head, face, or neck. There can be pushing of the person against a solid surface like a wall or downstairs, for example, all of which will transmit forces either directly or indirectly into the brain, which is a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, or has the potential to be one. The other major form of brain injury that's quite common in physical intimate partner violence is non-fatal strangulation. So here it is you're injuring the brain through a mechanism of cutting off the oxygen and blood supply to the brain, or significantly reducing it at least. And that can lead to disruptions in brain function and loss of consciousness and long-term disability or even death in a remarkably short period of time, on the order of minutes. And so both of those mechanisms contribute to various aspects of brain dysfunction following episodes of intimate partner violence. And quite often they're combined in the same episode, and quite often they're repeated multiple times over the course of months or years. And so all of this can contribute to various dysfunction that you will see when you do assessments at some point after the most recent episode.
And for people who do the work in the front line, do you find that a lot of this is occurring that they have the systems in place to support, or is that something that you think we need a lot more work on?
Our systems haven't yet quite caught up with how prevalent and devastating an issue this is. We know from the research that is still really in its infancy compared to where we are with sports concussion, that as many as 92% of women will report blows to the face, head, and neck, which might then indicate a brain injury. And yet many of our frontline workers and systems are still not aware of this and are not operating in a sort of brain injury informed capacity. So More and more women's shelters and transition houses are becoming aware that this is a really prevalent issue among their clients. And so they are, many of them doing training, many of them doing assessments for brain injury with clients. At the same time, our systems of care haven't yet caught up. So getting these survivors the healthcare they need, the other support services in the community that could benefit them is still incredibly challenging. So a big piece of what we've been doing with SOAR is just getting out there and educating anyone who will listen that this is a massive issue, that it's affecting tens of thousands of women in this country every year, and that many of those women don't even know they have a brain injury. They just wonder why they're having so many challenges.
Absolutely. And Karen, you raised such important points that sort of draws me into my next question. So SOAR has been a national leader in raising awareness around IPV-caused brain injuries. What inspired the founding of SOAR? And I know you already talked about some of the gaps in care, but could you speak a bit more to some of the gaps in care you're seeing at this time in your work?
SOAR came to be after I read an article that connected brain injury to intimate partner violence. And at the time, I was running Kelowna Women's Shelter as its executive director and working in the gender-based violence sector with survivors, hiring staff, training staff, going to conferences. And the fact that many of our survivors who had dealt with physical intimate partner violence were probably dealing with ongoing challenges from brain injury had never come up. And I was shocked. And I think it's how it is for many people on this issue. Once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And you start to realize all these things that may have seemed like, difficult behavior or mental health issues in survivors could actually be physical, legitimate ramifications of a brain injury caused by their former or current partner. And we just knew we had to do something. And the more we looked into it, the more we realized people didn't know this, and care wasn't being provided, assessments weren't being done, accommodations weren't being made for these survivors. And so we just wanted to do something. And when I approached Paul with it, what did you do?
I went on PubMed and looked at, typed in intimate partner violence and brain injury or concussion. I can't remember the exact terms, and was fully expecting, hundreds or thousands of articles to pop up on my screen. And I think there was a grand total of about 20. And only like 2 or 3 were actual like scientific assessments, lab-based assessments of different aspects of brain function. Most were kind of commentaries on this is something that's probably happening and we need to do better to provide better support. So there's a huge knowledge gap, first of all, and from the science perspective, and then there's a huge knowledge and practice gap in terms of the different support systems and how they can provide care that's informed by the fact that brain injury is likely happening. So there's a long list of projects that need to be done. It's been really encouraging. Like, we've been at it for about 10 years now, and when we started, there was probably 2 or 3 other groups or people who were working in this space
In the world.
And we very quickly, came together and, have known each other for a while now and continue to push on this issue. And so, I would go to brain injury meetings, and I distinctly remember the first time talking about this with colleagues at a conference on brain injury, colleagues across Canada. And like, I was the only person that was working on this, and it was eye-opening, I think, for everyone. And at the same time, it's intimidating from a science and clinical care perspective because it's so complex, right? And so I think that has made it a little bit more challenging to get a lot of momentum. But in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been really exciting to see it really expand and get a bunch of people that are way smarter than me working on this topic and or have access to more resources or just different, expertise to bring, different questions to bear. Like, I have a colleague in New York who does neuropathological investigations and has published a study recently looking at the neuropathological consequences from brain samples of people who had previously in their life experienced intimate partner violence. and showed really clear evidence that there's absolutely something going on in terms of neurodegenerative processes in their brain. It's not Alzheimer's disease necessarily. It's not chronic traumatic encephalopathy like what you see in retired collision sport athletes, but it's something. And it has an impact in terms of their function, or it did when they were still alive. So it's exciting to see all the different lenses through which this issue is being addressed.
And it became, when we first started this work, the focus was we need to educate women's shelter workers because that's often a first point of contact after a woman's disclosed and she's there and we can identify and maybe find ways to help. But Paul will say it quickly went from this to this because we started to realize that anyone who ever works with or supports women is probably encountering this, whether they realize it or not. And so we started talking about who else we had to scream and shout about this too. And it's lawyers, it's child protection social workers, it's doctors, it's nurses, it's mental health counselors, it's paramedics, it's firefighters, it's police. And we've been doing our best to educate as many as possible, but some of the issues, particularly on the legal side, we know that women who've experienced violence often have a lot of challenges and struggles, particularly when it comes to, issues with family court or with child protection orders. And there seems to be this notion that if a woman has a brain injury, that equals that she's an unfit parent. But we know that's not the case. Certainly if I as a mom play hockey with my girlfriends and got a concussion, child protection is not showing up at my door on a Monday to take my kids. So addressing that concern and challenge with our frontline advocates has been an important piece of the work because there's a lot of concern about maybe we shouldn't even talk about brain injury because we don't want to put these women at risk for losing their children. But we've come to a place of how can we ignore something that is a health concern for which we could actually find supports to provide that would allow a family to stay together. So educating those frontline family lawyers, judges, and child protection teams has been a really key priority in terms of providing that extra support for survivors.
Absolutely. And although I know you both spoke about it a bit in the webinar, Paul, you mentioned you've been doing this work for about 10 years. For our listeners, can you share just a little bit about what made you shift through what you used to work on, which was sports-related injuries, to this field?
Yeah, so Karen and I met and we actually started dating. And shortly after we met, she came across this article describing the links between brain injury and intimate partner violence and kind of had her light bulb moment and pretty quickly sent it to me. And my first kind of thought was, this has got to be something that, a lot of people have studied, and quickly discovered that it wasn't. And very quickly after that, actually got in contact with a colleague who is at Harvard, Dr. Eve Valera, who's really the pioneer in all of this. She did a groundbreaking study in 2003 that basically characterized the different aspects of neurocognitive dysfunction in women who've experienced brain injury from intimate partner violence. And so, I got on the phone and we had like a 2.5 hour long chat about, how important it is to do this work, all the challenges associated with doing it, the challenges in terms of getting funding, the challenges in terms of actually doing the research in a systematic and rigorous way. And then we were off to the races after that. And like I say, continue to be excited about how it's grown and got quite a bit of momentum. We were just at a couple of recent conferences that were brain injury conferences. And so most of the research being discussed was in the context of sport-related concussion. But almost everyone in their introductory slides would mention, what are some mechanisms by which brain injury occurs? And almost everyone said intimate partner violence, even though they weren't studying that. So that was encouraging, just that other brain injury researchers and people providing support for folks with brain injury are now aware of the fact that this is another injury mechanism, and the possibility that someone who's involved in that in the research decides that they want to go down that road of learning more about it in the context of intimate partner violence. So it's really interesting to see its growth.
And really, Paul switched because I asked him to.
See, that's the best kind of partner, both in life and in work.
We hadn't been dating that long, and I said, "Come on, we have to do this." And he said, "All right," because he wanted to keep me around, and it's worked out. We still like each other most of the time.
It's a smart man.
I mean, it's an interesting partnership because, quite often it's a brain injury researcher or a clinician who is involved that has, starts to become interested in intimate partner violence, or it's someone from a community agency or advocate who, isn't maybe their researcher or doesn't know much about brain injury. And so they're almost more siloed, whereas we bring, our expertise and experience together and it's complementary, right? Like, I distinctly remember when we first started giving presentations like what we did today, Karen said, well, you can't just show all the graphs you normally show at a scientific conference because the audience probably won't understand it or it'll, and so I quickly learned to make my language more approachable.
Yes. What I said was, you need to speak real English, not science. I sometimes would joke at conferences, like, if you don't understand something Paul says, just, we'll fill you in at the end because English is his second language, science is his first language. But I come from a background, my original career was journalism and marketing and communications. So for me, it's always about how do we take this really important information and make it accessible and turn it into practice, as opposed to these incredible research publications that, sit on a shelf gathering dust or only get heard by researchers in the same area. And some of this work is so important, and it affects real people in such devastating ways that I think the partnership allowed us, in ways that others maybe haven't been able to get that information out there and broadcast it to the world a little bit differently and a little more broadly than a typical researcher might be able to do.
I still like showing graphs, though.
Yeah.
I say this from the background of academic. I also tune out during graphs. So Karen's like, speak more accessible English. I totally am on board,
Yes.
but I get that too.
When our first kind of big talk we did together was a TEDx talk in our community of Kelowna, and I sort of developed the narrative framework for this talk, and then sent it to Paul and said, "Look, just drop your sciencey slides in the middle." And he sends it back, and there's slide after slide with these dots all over the place, dots. And I'm like, okay, we can't use that. We can't use that. We can't use that. We need to explain it in English. So he still gets to use the graphs, as he said, when he does like science presentations, and I still don't understand what they mean. But he's gotten much better at using plain language and really while still using appropriate terminology.
Yeah.
Well, then I think my next question, actually, Paul, will tap right into both of those skills. Can you help us understand a little bit more about the specific neurocognitive effects survivors may experience following IPV-related brain injuries and what symptoms often go unnoticed?
Yeah, so I mean, we've published a number of papers looking at neurocognitive deficits, as well as others have as well. And so kind of all the classics like learning, memory, attention, executive function, depending upon the type of assessment you use, you can get either more sensitive or less sensitive or more detailed. And depending upon how you measure and assess the history of brain injury from intimate partner violence, a lot of studies a lot of more recent studies have used almost simpler questionnaires, which you either have a history or you don't. So you have two groups and you're comparing them, and you basically say, here's an assessment looking at this particular function, let's say attention, where the group that had experienced brain injury from intimate partner violence performs worse than the group that hadn't experienced brain injury from intimate partner violence. The questionnaire that we've used historically is one that basically gives you a proxy for the amount of exposure or the load, for lack of a better word, how many times or how severe or how frequent they had IPV episodes that result in signs or symptoms of potential brain injury. And so there you can actually look at, the question becomes, are those with more exposure, do they have more bigger deficits in terms of attention or executive function than those with less exposure? And that kind of gets at this issue of like, what is the control group that you use if you're wanting to do comparisons? And so in the ideal world, your control group has also experienced intimate partner violence and all the other comorbid factors that go along with that, like PTSD, depression, anxiety, etc. But they haven't had a brain injury. So if there was any physical violence, it was directed to some other part of their body, or it was, say, emotional or psychological abuse as opposed to physical abuse. So you get all of those comorbid factors, still contributing in a pretty significant way. But the actual physical injury to the brain might not be present or might be much less of a contributing factor than those who, in which it happened a lot. Maybe they had episodes of non-fatal strangulation. Maybe sometimes they had loss of consciousness or post-traumatic amnesia, indicating there was a more severe potential brain injury. And the expectation is, the ones that had more exposure or more load are going to perform worse on all these measures of cognitive function. And that seems to be borne out by the data. And so, some of those, and I think this is things that Karen talks about quite often in her presentations, kind of from a practice perspective. If you're in a women's shelter or some other context where you're regularly interacting with a survivor who's gone through this, they may exhibit signs or symptoms that you might, think are due to something else. Basically them not wanting or being defiant or oppositional. Whereas it might just be they're overwhelmed, right? They're overwhelmed by the lights or the sounds, or they can't concentrate enough because of their brain injuries, as opposed to some of these other factors. And so, kind of taking a step back, I think, and being curious about how much of this might be due to a brain injury, and if you can potentially do some assessments like the HELPS tool or the CHATS tool to get basically a screen of the fact that this may have happened, then you can maybe approach supporting them in a different way and making referrals to a system that isn't set up to receive referrals, but potentially if the person has enough resources or is able to advocate on their own behalf, that then they might be able to get the help and care they need. But that's probably the biggest barrier that we're seeing right now is getting people the supports and care they need.
Absolutely. And thinking about those barriers, what are some of the most common myths or misunderstandings about brain injury among both survivors and service providers? Because I imagine that lends itself to these conversations too.
One of the myths is that people sometimes think you can only have a concussion or other brain injury if you've lost consciousness. And in fact, losing consciousness when we're talking about concussion anyway, only happens in about 10% of cases. So that's one of the myths that both service providers and just people in the general population, I think, tend to believe. Another one is the whole don't let a survivor of concussion go to sleep. That's definitely a myth because the brain needs some sleep to heal. But what the current recommendations are?
For a mild DBI, it's a couple of days. And if the symptoms aren't too bad, then starting up some form of activity, either physical or mental, within that time. And then actually pushing yourself, certainly in the context of sport-related concussion, the goal is to get the person back as soon as possible. And kind of physical exercise fairly early on is considered an appropriate thing for folks to do for a variety of reasons. And I use the phrase push the system a little bit. So even if the symptoms get a little bit worse as a result of doing the physical activity, as long as they don't overdo it, that's better in terms of speed of recovery and extent of recovery than avoiding physical activity because you still have some symptoms. And so it's a bit of a nuanced and kind of a fine line, but it definitely has been shown to be effective. And so there's no reason why you couldn't also do something like that in survivors of intimate partner violence.
Another one thing that makes it difficult is that brain injury is invisible. So these survivors, it's not like if they break their leg and they have a cast, right? And we know there's an injury. And the expectations that frontline service providers and survivors themselves put on themselves don't fit with the limitations because of the brain injury. So if a woman shows up at a shelter with a cast on her leg, nobody's going to ask her to run across the room. And yet these women with brain injury are asked to fill out forms. They're asked to go to all kinds of appointments. They're asked to tell their story the exact same way every time. And I think these are some of the challenges. It's hard for people to conceive that a physical injury has occurred if they can't see something. So that's definitely a challenge when we're dealing both with service organizations and general public and survivors themselves.
Absolutely. And I think we see that kind of pop up when we talk about how law enforcement, how anyone responds, where it's moved so much further beyond what you can see with the naked eye. A lot of your work talks about kind of trauma and trauma-informed care. So how does brain injury intersect with trauma, and how can this complicate diagnosis or complicate care?
I mean, I could talk about that from a scientific perspective, which is we have to take all of that complexity into account. And that's certainly what we do. So we do assessments of all the things we can think about that have been linked to intimate partner violence in general. Um, uh, and then, we measure our key variables of interest. So let's say it's aspects of cognitive function or brain blood flow, for example. And we know from research, mainly in sport-related concussion, but in other injury mechanisms, how those different functions or physiological processes are affected by a brain injury. So we have something to compare it to already out there. And then, collect the data, do the assessments, do the analysis to basically be able to say, like I mentioned before, people with more exposure perform worse, or their physiology is more dysfunctional than people who have less exposure. So that's the kind of most basic level. And then you kind of follow that up by doing, multiple regression analysis and other forms of fancy statistical analyses to be able to disentangle, well, how much of that change is due to the exposure to potential brain injury versus all these other comorbid factors that come along with intimate partner violence. Again, PTSD, depression, anxiety, all the other ones. And so when we put all that into a fancy regression model, we're able to disentangle to a certain extent. Most of it's due to brain injury, but some of it's due to PTSD, for example. And I think that informs potential care and supports too, right? Like you can't just treat brain injury all by itself in this population because it's modified and modulated by these other factors that also need to be addressed.
And certainly one thing we've noted with service providers, again, we learned this early on, we can't just educate people in brain injury because our brain injury specialists know lots about brain injury, but if they don't know about the nuance and complexities and the dynamics of intimate partner violence, and they don't understand trauma-informed practice and language, then they're not going to be much good to a survivor of intimate partner violence brain injury. So it became clear really early on that there's a lot of cross-training that has to happen, because in that Venn diagram of brain injury and trauma, there's a lot of overlap, but it's not total. And so in reality, if you take a trauma-informed approach, you're probably going to hit a lot of the pieces you need to when it comes to things like anxiety, depression, but the brain injury and the sort of cognitive function stuff is a little different. So we really have to take all of it into account and just throw everything at the wall and see what works.
That's so true. And I know a lot of your work, you advocate about trauma-informed care and brain injury-informed approaches to care. And for our listenership, can you unpack a little bit more about what that looks like and how frontline health or social service providers can adopt that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's people talk about trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care as meeting people where they're at. But I think a lot of us don't get what that actually means. We all bring our own scope of experience, knowledge, expertise, and opinion to every situation. And if we're truly trauma informed, we throw that out the window because it isn't about us. It's not about me and my opinions and my judgment and my expertise. It's about this person in front of me. So when we're talking about being trauma informed, we kind of shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, to understanding that the responses people have to traumatic events in their life, whether they be a singular traumatic event and it's caused them, post-traumatic stress disorder, or it's years, maybe through adverse childhood experiences or through intimate partner violence, these things cause legitimate physical ramifications. And so understanding that and making it about centering this person and what they need, and we can help them get there, but without telling them what to do. And we don't want to should all over somebody. You don't ever want to say, you should do this or you need to do this. We really want to be taking this open, curious approach where we're asking open-ended questions, putting power back in their hands, creating opportunities for them to decide and to tell you what they need or what they want in a particular situation, because they're the expert in their own lives. And it doesn't matter if I think they should do something else, because it's not about me in this moment. I can find ways to plant seeds, to offer information, to offer resources, to show true support so that the person and I can develop some relationship of trust, such that if they're not, say, ready to leave an abusive relationship, maybe the seeds I plant will help them get there eventually, and maybe they'll call me when it's time. I could talk about this for days, but that's a really quick, just centering the other person and leaving our own stuff at the door such that we let them guide whatever our conversation is or the path is.
I think another kind of bigger picture policy issue around this is, at least for folks who make use of women's shelters and transition houses and second stage housing in particular, is having that system have more capacity so that people can remain in those institutions for longer periods of time, just to create more space for themselves to recover, right? And the current, at least with shelters, is, depending upon the province, it's a relatively brief period of time, right? And you've got to do all these things as you leave an abusive relationship and attempt to move on with your life. And if you're trying to do all those things with a brain injury underlying it all, it's very difficult. And we would never do that with a weekend warrior athlete or a young athlete who gets a concussion, right? If you get hit into the boards on a Friday night in your hockey game, we won't ask you to go find a new place to live on Monday morning, right? Like, it's just nonsense to think about that, but that's the reality for a lot of folks in this situation.
Absolutely. And so thinking about things like gaps that you've talked about or things that are missed, can you share a story or an insight that illustrates the consequences of a missed diagnosis and possibly the transformative impact that proper recognition and support have for a survivor?
So I'll tell you about a woman I'll call Jane, not her real name, a woman who I met while working at Kelowna Women's Shelter and got to know quite well, who shared her story with us and allowed us to use parts of her story as part of the concussion awareness training tool for women support workers. So she experienced a brain injury. She was thrown out of a moving vehicle by her partner. She was taken to the hospital by her partner. And as I mentioned in our presentation, she was treated like she was drunk or high. She was not separated from her abuser with any kind of physical space. She was not asked about any kind of intimate partner violence. And so she left that experience with no real diagnosis, with no real support, and with no trust in the system. The next time he strangled her to unconsciousness, she didn't go to the hospital. And in a future incident, she was diagnosed with a concussion. This was with another partner, and just sent home with a piece of paper with some information. So her trajectory, she later, having left these abusive relationships with her very young daughter at the time, found herself dealing with all kinds of challenges and had no idea why she had all these challenges. She said, I would get so angry all the time and I never understood why, because I was never an angry person. She was unable to do the tasks that used to make her a superstar at work. She oversaw these massive operations and kept everything going and everything in place. She couldn't do any of that now. She didn't understand why. She wasn't able to find the same level of employment she had before. So her economic situation suffered and her self-confidence suffered. And she's mothering a young child. So she, all on her own, had to develop, as we do, systems so they could function. So she would set alarms on her phone through the entire day to remind her to do all the basic things, not just an alarm to get out of bed. And these weren't calendar reminders. An alarm would go off to get out of bed. An alarm would go off to brush her teeth. An alarm would go off to get her daughter out of bed. An alarm would go off to brush her daughter's hair. An alarm would go off to make their meals. every single piece of the day was an alarm on her phone. And she came up with this system because she had to deal, but she had no idea what was wrong with her and why she was having these challenges. When it came to feeding her daughter, she had to create this system of sticky notes on the cupboards so that she'd remember to make meals and then to remember a kind of meal and what to put in it. She had sticky notes all over her cupboards. So all of this was a direct result of experiencing brain injury at the hands of a partner and it not going recognized or diagnosed or supported. And so when she connected with us and learned about this intersection, it blew her mind and she felt vindicated and she felt validated that there wasn't something wrong with her, that she wasn't a failure, that all these challenges that she'd had to come up with solutions for were a direct result of the violence she'd experienced at the hands of two different partners. And she'll talk about if only she'd known earlier, she could have possibly got some medical support and other supports rather than floundering and failing and not thriving. So she's a really good example of some of these gaps. Now this all happened for her at least 15 years ago. Our system, we're getting there slowly. People are more aware and maybe it would be different now, but I'm not sure.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us so well to the final question I have in the way to sort of wrap up this very important conversation is thinking about policy or system level changes like you just touched on. What changes do you believe are necessary to ensure fewer survivors go undiagnosed and untreated in Canada and beyond?
Well, we're working on one right now, which is the word you just mentioned, diagnosis. So it's unclear that a survivor of potential brain injury from intimate partner violence could ever 100% confidently be diagnosed with a brain injury. It would have to be a pretty special set of circumstances in order for that to occur. And so then it kind of, the question becomes, well, is it okay to say that we've detected that they have a probable or possible brain injury? And what does that mean from a healthcare perspective? Like, is that sufficient in order for them to be able to access care and for clinicians to be able to appropriately refer them? I think the healthcare system needs to be a little bit more flexible around that. I get it from a purely health economics perspective. Like you have to be efficient in terms of how you make use of your human and infrastructure resources and people's time and et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, if people are falling through the cracks, just because you can't diagnose them to whatever threshold is required to access that care, you're probably doing a pretty big disservice. And so that's one where, the conversations become, well, who do we engage with? What sort of information do they need? Is it, the Canadian Medical Association that we need to go and advocate on behalf of survivors to be able for them to, implement some potential change? Because at the end of the day, we can make all the doctors and nurses in the world more aware of it. But if they run into a system that's static and can't, has too high of barriers, then they're not going to be able to provide the help that they can, which would be really unfortunate.
The other systemic piece that is really needed is on that education side. Right now, our healthcare professionals do not get much education in concussion and brain injury in general. And so ensuring that intimate partner violence and the intersection with brain injury become part of the required curriculum for medical schools, for social work schools, well, for everyone, I think is a key systemic piece that has to happen. And then increased recognition of this issue and funding to support care through our healthcare systems. It's unfortunate that healthcare is a provincial responsibility because it's, we have to kind of go province and territory at a time. But those are some really important and key, and ongoing funding for research is another piece. But the big thing we have to do is smash the patriarchy, and that is a much bigger job.
Yeah. But it sounds like all the work you do contributes so well to all of these, including patriarchy smashing, which I agree with you is incredibly important. Well, thank you both so much for having this conversation with me today. I so appreciate it. It was lovely to get to know more about your work.
Thanks for having us and for your interest and for the work you do.
Yes, thank you.
Our pleasure, absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.